Um, our third speaker is Bob Megginson. He's a professor of mathematics at the University of Michigan. He originally worked in the area of pure mathematics, but his interest in the earth and environmental sciences has been stimulated both by the interesting mathematics involved in climate change, as well as the importance of having more indigenous people of the U.S. involved in solving issues of climate change that are already impacting them. He is himself Lakota and has described his work at the University of Michigan as his, quote, day job, since he also spent most summers in the 1990s as an adjunct faculty at the American Indian Tribal College in North Dakota. In that capacity and in many other opportunities to interact with tribal organizations, he has learned about and directly seen diplomacy between tribal peoples at its best and at its worst. Megginson received his BS in physics, AM in statistics, and PhD in mathematics from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. Bob Megginson.
Thank you, Gary. An Petawashta, excuse me, it's not noon yet. An Enewashta, I gave you the wrong greeting, and I am embarrassed. I'm very delighted to speak on a subject that really is very near and dear to my heart. I was trying to decide what to say today because I really had two choices. Gary has heard me within the last 2 months go on for about an hour, I believe, in February at the AAAS meeting on a subject that really represents the Navajo Nation mass circles. It really represents some of the very best in what diplomacy with tribes can do. I was thinking about trying to present a lot of specific examples, but I think that there is enough unknown in this area that I decided to focus instead on some general principles that I've learned as someone who has a foot in each of two canoes. That's a native saying. Well, you understand what it means, okay. It's a native saying that people often say about trying to, if you ever try that, by the way, you're going to get wet. So anyway, I decided that was what I was going to do. So I managed to set down the clicker. You can't really talk about general principles without understanding a little bit about the historical context for this. I think most of you, if I would say, well, the 5-second version of this history could be just labeled the Trail of Broken Treaties, and I don't want to rant on about that. But I do think there's some specific things in the history of this that are really important to understand. For the basis of understanding some of the general principles that I've learned for doing diplomacy with tribal groups and indigenous people in general. So now look, I intended this PowerPoint also to be a document people could refer to, so please don't worry about speed reading all the stuff you're going to see on a few of these slides because I'm going to summarize it. There was a period from 1778 to 1871 that was called the treaty period. It was ended by actually statute on March 3rd, 1871. The first of the treaties was signed with the Lenni Lenape people. Some call them the Delaware. So just like some people call my people the Sioux. So there are always other people's names for yourself, for the other people prefer to call you. It was signed in 1778. In 1779, it became the first of the treaties that got broken. What was supposed to happen was this would seal a bond of friendship between the U.S. and this tribe that would make them allies during the war with the British. And in fact, they were so upset with the way that the treaty was not honored that they became British allies, which is unfortunate. The last of the treaties really was signed in 1871. There's a possible exception, but let's just say 1871. But with over 400 treaties, or excuse me, nearly 400 treaties, which by the way are still recognized by the Department of State as being valid. The fact that the treaty forming period ended does not mean that the validity of the treaties ended. They're still recognized and to some extent are still in force. So the nature of the treaties, most required surrender of Indian land in trade for promises that that would be the end of it, and that was not always the case. The treaties also required some other things, such as annual payments, free health care, which by and large is available. I have been the guest of the Indian Health Service myself. Also, education, which is also somewhat honored today, too. Important stop along the treaty trail was a couple of decisions that if you're going to do diplomacy with American Indian peoples and particularly reservation-based peoples, you really need to know about these decisions. One was by the John Marshall Supreme Court in the early part of the 19th century that actually declared that tribes were something called domestic dependent nations, and they needed to be treated with, at least partially, as if they are independent nations, though they are dependent nations, and also in a sense. That term has not been well defined, and there are a lot of reasons that Native people would prefer that it not be well defined. But it still today affects a lot of interactions with Native tribes, with Native nations. In 1832, it was used in a decision that declared that the Cherokee Nation of Georgia was actually sovereign, and in a recently passed law, the U.S. Indian Removal Act, whose intent was to take all the Indians in Georgia and move them to what was called Indian Territory in eastern Oklahoma, what's now eastern Oklahoma. It was declared to be illegal, unconstitutional, and violated treaties. So that was the end of it, right? Well, that actually led almost to a constitutional crisis because the President of the United States, Andrew Jackson, he just plainly refused to obey it. And there's this wonderful quote, which is probably apocryphal, that Chief Justice John Marshall has made his decision, now let him find the troops to enforce it. But in any case, Jackson did just ignore it, and he sent the Army actually to move all the folks to Oklahoma. Well, almost all. There were some Cherokee actually that hid out in Georgia and now moved south and now constitute the Eastern Cherokee Band. But most ended up in Indian Territory. That was a 5-minute version, though I probably went a little more than 5 minutes on it. If you're really interested in this, you want to hear the 1-hour version, there's a map there that shows you how you can take a half-hour walk to the National Museum of the American Indian from here, which has right now a wonderful exhibit on display, exhibition on display, about diplomacy with American Indian tribes. And you'll see all of this and much more if you just go do that. So consider that part of your education if you're going to be treating with American Indian tribes. Now, what are the principles that I'm sort of going to extract from that? American Indians, as it says up there, have a strong tradition of remembering the past through oral tradition and just through general knowledge we share with each other. And therefore, I thought it was really important here to include George Santayana's famous statement about those who cannot remember the past being condemned to repeat it, because we do not want to repeat that past. So, what are some principles? I grew up, well, my teen years were in the 60s, so yeah, I'm partly a Trekkie. And so I've got to talk about the prime directive, or scientific diplomacy with American Indian tribes, which is this. And it's based on that history that you just saw. If people are going to make promises of benefits to a tribe from a scientific partnership, they must be scrupulously kept within the promised time frame. As an adjunct faculty member at a tribal college, I've seen that not happen, where a group would come in, had been told that if you can get an American Indian tribe or particularly a tribal college to sign on as a partner to this particular project, it's going to be much more likely to be funded. They will come in, and the funding agency certainly has the right to believe that. When you see the tribe actually said, yes, we'll be glad to be a partner. But what happens is then after the funding occurs, they never see them again. That's the end of it. And I've seen that happen. And I'll tell you, that creates a god-awful mess for the next group that wants to come in and do this and then asks, why is it that you won't even return our phone calls? It's because of a memory of what has happened in the past and a desire not to have it continue. So that really is extremely important. And it's important to understand that all science done by others on Indian land is a scientific partnership, even if you think you're going to be doing it all by yourself. It's also important to recognize that tribal entities are not just another regional governmental authority. As an example, in my home state of Michigan, okay, there have been instances where people have put up radio telescopes. I think one the University of Michigan put up that involved not, the standard dish type of telescope, but a bunch of wires. It was done on private land in a particular county, and there were people who just didn't like it very much because it didn't look nice. But they also recognized the fact that when it was done on private land, they didn't have much that they could do about it. Okay, you shouldn't try that. I'm saying it as if you would try this, okay? I should say if somebody were to try that on a reservation, they would discover that there's much more of a sense of ownership of the entire area that occurs with all the people in that particular tribal group or on that reservation that might occur with the people in that county. It's important to recognize that. And it's not because the land is held in common. In most cases, it's not. It is privately owned. But there still is that recognition that there's some sort of a national boundary there that means that you really do have an interest in seeing that not happen. So it's important to recognize that. Have there ever been instances where this has not happened? You don't even have to have this as part of a reservation. Because the controversies that surround those big telescopes on Mauna Kea actually are an example of this. Even though that is not Indian land in the sense of a title being held, there is still a strong sense of possession, and you need to recognize that if you're working with tribes. And I need to recognize I shouldn't keep setting this thing down. You need to seek partners on the reservations in particular, but among tribal groups. But you have to be also realistic about what they can contribute. The tribal colleges are, in theory, you see these lists of colleges that have geoscience programs in them, and it's spectacular how many of the tribal colleges show up. But it's important to be aware of what those are. Almost all of them are sustainability or resource development programs, which is fine. I think that's a terrific thing to have. But they're generally conducted by people who are not really formally trained in that area, except that they do have a really deep knowledge of what is needed to make these things work with that particular people or on that reservation. And you should not just ignore them or say, well, they don't really have anything to contribute to my particular project. They don't have the training. You really should, here I am going, I'm pointing, all right, you. People who do this should really discover and respect what the faculty at the college can contribute to a scientific endeavor, because if you engage them, they provide an entry to the community. First of all, it can be very valuable. And secondly, you're going to be really surprised about how much they actually understand about the local environmental and geophysical parameters of the area. So don't dismiss that at all. This is a long quote from Ross Swimmer, who was formerly principal chief of the Cherokee Nation. I'm just going to summarize it by saying, don't assume that once you've worked on my reservation that you can take that knowledge and go down and work on the Navajo reservation with it, because their culture, their history, their problems are completely different. Okay? Overlap. So diplomatic interactions with tribes do require a knowledge of historic and current culture, historic and current interactions with other tribes and the majority culture. I can think of a couple tribes, if you're going to work with them in the Southwest, you better understand that there are terrific frictions between those tribes nowadays, of those two particular tribes. You need to know that, and you also need to understand the power structure of the tribe, because it can be, I don't think I want to make the following quote if it's being recorded, but I'm going to go ahead and say it anyway. The people who are really in charge may not be the ones who think are in charge, and you need to have worked with the tribe enough to know that. A recognition of the complex attitude that Native people have toward traditional Native religion, spirituality, and cultural imperatives, because this has gotten whole disciplines into a lot of trouble. I'll tell you, I love the high Rockies. I'm a climber. My goal is to climb, all the 14ers, okay, mountain in the Rockies, over 14,000 feet in Colorado. I have most of them. Every time I climb one of them at the summit, I leave tobacco. I thank the Creator for getting me up there safely, and I ask the Creator to get me back down safely. Okay, I will tell you, I was not raised, nor do I will confess, and I apologize to my Mishkakiyepi, to my relatives on the reservation for this. I do not subscribe to the traditional Native religion. I was not raised to. But I respect the fact that many were, and I respect the fact that my ancestors were. And I honor them by doing that, and I am doing what they would expect of me in that situation. So, if somebody says, I have a comment there about spirituality, I'll let you read. When you hear a scientist say, you know, science does not deal with superstition, that's the end of any effort with diplomacy in that particular area. And I unfortunately have seen this happen in one discipline right now that is having terrific friction with Native people. It's not the geosciences. I will also mention, I'm not going to take the time to go through this. For those particularly like myself who are really interested in climate change, there's a collection of principles called the Bally Principles of Climate Justice. I won't go through them individually, but I'm going to I'll go ahead and list them up there. This is some I've excerpted from that. Climate justice requires, number 20, the right to self-determination of indigenous peoples and the right to control their lands and what people do on them, and that includes doing science. If you're going to be working in climate science or almost any other area involving the earth and environmental sciences on reservations, it's good to get a copy of these. You can find it online. Read them and think about it and try to make what you're doing conform to that, and they will thank you for it and are likely to let you come back. I'll give you two examples. One of, I think, a great example of successive diplomacy, and that is the Navajo Nation Math Circle project that I presented to the Committee on Opportunities and Sciences, well, along with some help from some people, including Tatiana Shubin, who founded this thing. And wow, did she do everything right. She became very interested in getting the Navajo children their math education upgraded, so she went to the reservation, she found colleagues, she said, you know, who should I talk to? She got introductions to the right people. She spent the time, a substantial amount of time, showing them that she wanted to help, and she was sincere, and she was not going to go away. She would be there and see it through. As a net result, the projects that she has helped found have reached about 900 students at this point in time, and some very large number of teachers. And believe me, the Navajo just love her for it. They love her so much that they did something almost unprecedented. They adopted her. And now, I believe, she actually was born and raised near Moscow, and I believe she is about the only Navajo who speaks English with an Eastern European accent. It's a terrific example, and I would urge you to contact her. I cannot talk about the next one without becoming angry and emotional. So, an example of one of its worst failures is what's happened to traditional native lands and peoples as part of the Alberta Tar Sands project. I'm going to be actually up in Alberta in November for another reason, working with some native groups and some other stuff. I can't, and I will have to drive across Route 1 through one of the big areas, and it always just really annoys me to do that. So I don't think, I do have one final suggestion. Okay, here's where I get myself into a lot of trouble referring to an example in this particular city. But if you want to convince people that you're doing the right thing in a diplomatic situation involving Native peoples, don't take a couple of us off, pull a couple of us out, even if we happen to be people who are prominent for some reason, and dust us off and say, see, American Indians think what we're doing is fine, okay? Because here are two examples. That doesn't work. We have had too much history of where that has been done to justify treaties. So I would just urge that not happen. I think I'm out of time, so I don't have a chance to do my Indian Charlie example. Do I? It would take about 2 minutes. Okay, let's see. Let's see if I can do this. Indian Charlie. That was what people called him. Really quickly, he was born in 1860 in Kansas. This is a quiz for you. Perhaps nearly half American Indian ancestry. He claimed to be 3/8. That probably is not true. He descended from Kaw and Osage chiefs. His great-grandfathers were such. He was an enrolled member of the Kaw tribe, grew up on the Kaw reservation. His first language, not English, was Kansa, followed by French, taught by his mother. His big goal was to be a famous American Indian horseman who actually wanted to compete in American Indian rodeos. And as a young boy, using those skills, Cheyenne warriors had actually attacked the Kaw reservation. This was settled bloodlessly, but he rode 60 miles with another Kaw person on the Kaw reservation, another Kaw Indian, to try to get help actually from the state governor to try to get troops to be sent, ignorant of the fact that this thing had actually been settled in 4 hours just by offering the Cheyenne something to eat. Okay, that works marvelously oftentimes with Indians. So here's a question, and this is not a trick question. Oh, I'm sorry. One other item. Much later in his life, he was an enrolled Kaw member all his life. The tribe tried to cancel his enrollment. He really fought against this, and he succeeded because he was very proud of that fact that he was enrolled in that tribe. So here's the question, and this is not a trick question. Was Indian Charlie, as he was known to most people, was he an American Indian? Of course he's an American Indian, for Pete's sakes, okay? So who was Indian Charlie? There's actually a point relating to that last diplomatic point I mentioned. And it just astonishes me that this isn't taught in American history. Now, I just want to ask real quickly, please don't step on my punchline by shouting it out. Does anybody, just raise your hands, anybody here know who I'm talking about? It's remarkable that this is not taught in American history because it's the answer to a trivia question that almost anybody will get wrong. Who is the first person of color elected to national office in this country? Indian Charlie. Did you know that? It wasn't exactly a secret that he was an American Indian. He invited Indians to supply the music at his inauguration. Okay, now why is this relevant? Okay. Particularly before he was Herbert Hoover was vice president in the 1890s, he had a terrific amount of respect among folks as a highly placed Indian, right? And so therefore, when he said, I'm going to push an act through Congress, the Curtis Allotment Act, that's going to break up the big reservations in Oklahoma and force the Indians to assimilate with the majority population because I think that's what's best for them. Obviously, it was a good thing to do because a highly placed person like him, even at that time, says it's okay. We had too much history of that, so don't make that mistake. And I thank you, I should say, Pilamaya, thank you for the opportunity to present this.
We have time for questions for Bob. Comment? Yes, sir.
Bob, this is a question. Brian Weave, the U.S. National Ecological Observatory Network on NEON. So we have begun very early preliminary explorations into working with a federated tribe called the Tulalip tribes up in the Seattle area. And so I want to get your comments about open data. And so that's an issue that we've been working with them on and getting their thoughts on how do you work with their leaders to form an informed consent around projects that are conducted within their jurisdiction and collecting data, for example, about plant phenology, how plants, botanicals, for example, ethnobotanicals that will change in response to climate change, and how do you work around informed consent to collect the data and actually share the data with the outside world and the various issues that it touches around culture and practice. And so we'd like to get a comment around open data and how the tribes might actually think about the sensitivities associated with open data.
Well, I think the first thing, I'm going to probably just say things that you've already dealt with, but they're kind of the obvious ones to start with. First of all, you find out within each of the tribes that you have to, if you have a federated tribal group, oftentimes, as in Michigan, for instance, we have a group that has formed a federation among the tribes to deal with the Native American remain repatriation issues. Sometimes the tribes will say, we will at least do this, we'll do this much to make sure that you have one organization you have to deal with. And in part that is kind of to protect themselves from having this business of disagreements make headlines to the extent where somebody can say, well, look, the Indians can't agree on this, so let's just go ahead and do it. So that sometimes is just for self-protection, to fight out the issues internally before it's actually done publicly, before there's a position made publicly. But certainly it's a matter primarily of saying to whatever group has to agree that this is okay, just saying, first of all, who is it that has to agree that this is okay? And also convince them that you are going to respect that decision, which is sometimes there are issues about the difference between legality and the reality of it, because sometimes people may legally have to respect certain decisions, but there are ways around it, and those should not be done, of course. But to find out who has to do it, and then also to make sure that you have a mechanism for monitoring, and that's the piece that sometimes monitoring their agreement, because that's the piece that sometimes is missing. What happens is people believe that they have an agreement from a tribal group. And this, in fact, goes all the way back to that 1778 treaty with the Lenape people. This didn't happen. Okay, actually the problem was that there was a misunderstanding on the two sides of what the Lenape had agreed to. So it's really important that after you have decided, after you have gotten assent to do something, to make sure, insist for the Indian group to do it, even if they say it's not important, that there be people from their side of it that are involved in this at all steps of the process. So if something happens that they would say, wait a minute, we didn't anticipate that with our agreement things would go this way, you can then change course or do whatever you need to do to smooth that out before it becomes an explosive issue. Basically just talk, do a lot of talking.
So my name is Bob Marley. I work for the U.S. Department of Energy in the Office of International Affairs. And one of the jobs that I've had for the last 5 years is to be the director of the U.S.-China Clean Energy Research Center. And it occurred to me as I was listening to your principles that these things really are rooted, I would think, much more broadly in human respect and human nature. And I would think that these same principles might apply very broadly to science and diplomacy, anything that we try to do on kind of an international scale. In my experience with my counterparts in China, the thing that they respect most is mutual trust, is the idea that you're not coming to work with them as a senior partner, but as an equal. That you believe that you can get tremendous benefit by leveraging the competencies in their own country with the competencies that we might bring to the table. I mean, I know we have a long tradition of transferring benefits to less developed regions, but I was wondering if you would think about taking on a project of generalizing your manifesto or your principles so that it would apply more broadly to all kinds of international relationships in science and technology and diplomacy.
Actually, there was a point where I guess I didn't do it, that I was going to say you're going to recognize these principles as being ones that really do apply much more broadly. The only real difference, I think, is that perhaps that history that underlies it, that makes people much more sensitive to it in this particular case. But yes, absolutely. Everything you just said, I agree to. I agree to completely. It's interesting. In 1975, the AAAS actually did a study called the Barriers Study on why more American Indians aren't involved in mathematics. And so as a mathematician, I was very interested in that study. And it's fun to go back and read the thing from a perspective of what, now 40 years? Yeah, I did the arithmetic correctly. Okay. Sometimes you got to be careful. But they say there are three kinds of math. What's that? Yeah, there's an old saying, there are three kinds of mathematicians, the ones who can count and the ones who cannot. Okay. Now, anyway, in that study, it's interesting because the people who did the study said, you know, it's found that maybe American Indians learn mathematics a little bit differently from the way that other people did. And then the list, and I'm saying, look, this is a great study. I'm not condemning the study in any sense. Maybe they learned them a little bit differently. And then they listed the principles, you know, collaboration, collaborative learning, everything that we've learned since works for everybody. Okay, so yeah, oftentimes these things really are human principles and not principles involving Native people.
We have time for one more quick question, please.
Thank you. My name is Libby Lyons, and I'm from the National Science Foundation. Started in biology, and I now work in the international office, and I had the opportunity to work 3.5 years at the Department of State. Following up on the last question, I think the key issues here is the term sovereignty. Sovereignty, because it seems to me our culture of science often doesn't teach respect for sovereignty. That science, there's a belief somehow I've seen that science trumps sovereignty. So when we look at the Nagoya Protocol, when we look at the permits, the fact that countries have sovereignty over their biodiversity, how is it that we can help Americans understand that? And I think it's an ethical issue that we really haven't grappled with. Our system places all sorts of incentives to go and pick up the stuff. There's handheld sequencers. How are we going to really bring about science diplomacy if there isn't this fundamental respect for sovereignty? And I address this to both you and Tom Lovejoy.
I would say that right now, if you want to see, not particularly on the issue of science, but where a shooting war is almost, and in fact has started between two groups on this very point. Take a look at the Akwesasne Mohawk, okay, with their reservation, which actually spans an international boundary. And they believe that the state of New York will not recognize their sovereignty. And periodically have shots exchanged over the issue of collecting tobacco taxes. Yeah, we really do have to pay more attention to this.
And then I'll make a brief concluding remark as Rita prepares to have to leave.
So you just have to start with that. You know, and you're in somebody else's country, you're simple as that.